Hello everybody and welcome back to Revolutionary Left Radio. On today's episode we have back on the program longtime friend of the show, multiple appearance guest, my good friend and comrade, fellow organizer Brendan, to talk about fascism, anti-Semitism, and really to dive deep into the history and the complications in our understanding of fascism, how fascism manifests in different contexts, etc. And we've done lots of episodes on fascism throughout the history of Rev Left, and we're going to continue to do so because it's an important and huge phenomenon current in our society and is only getting stronger as the center falls out. And it is in so many ways, opposite of the world that we on the socialist left envision. So it's important that we don't fall into easy, knee-jerk, shallow understandings of fascism. And once you think that you have a good grasp on what fascism is, I think it can be helpful intellectually to complicate that puzzle a little bit and make you think through things more systematically, because like everything, fascism is an ever-evolving, open-ended, development and not a static thing that can be grasped once and for all. So we navigate and go through and explore many of the complications, the nuances of fascism, how we define it, what the history of it is, how to identify it, etc. And, Brendan didn't plug anything at the end of this episode, but I'll plug it for him, is his band. He's a local music artist as well as an organizer, and his band is called No Thanks. They recently released an album called Submerger. The outro song at the end of this episode will be one of the tracks off that wonderful album. He describes it as a sort of gothic Marxist anti-fascist album, and I love the band. I've seen them perform live. I just absolutely enjoy the music, and I hope some segment of the listenership to Rev Left enjoys it as well. So stay tuned for that at the end, and we'll link to in the show notes. We'll link to his band, so anybody who likes that music can go and find it and support a local Omaha punk band and full of great comrades, anti-fascists and organizers that I love very much and have personal relationships with. So definitely support them if you are so inclined. And as always, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, you can go to revolutionaryleftradio.com, find the Patreon to support us on, and in exchange you get bonus monthly content. But you can also find our sister programs, Red Menace, that I co-host with Allison Escalante, and Guerrilla History, that I co-host with Adnan Hussein and Henry Hakamaki. So if you haven't explored those other sister programs and you like what we do here at Rev Left, definitely check those out as well. If you can't support us financially, I totally understand. These are rotten times, but even leaving a good review on iTunes can do a lot. Once in a while, reactionaries, fascists will come across our show and they'll try to flood the rating system to bring down the ratings of various left-wing shows. And so anytime there's a left-wing show, whether it's ours or anyone that you enjoy, make sure to just go spend that 3 seconds throwing a 5-star rating to those shows, because I think every left-wing show does have some waves of reactionaries who in almost every case don't even listen to the program, but just see the title or just see what it's basically oriented around and will leave a shitty comment just to take that rating down. So those little things, they do help. So without further ado, let's get into this wonderful conversation on fascism, anti-Semitism, and a bunch of other topics with my good friend and comrade Brendan. Enjoy.
Hi, my name is Brendan. I am a semi-frequent guest on the show at this point, and I'm always happy to be here. Not super happy to be talking about fascism, but here we are. Yeah. Here's the world we live in.
Yeah, well, welcome back to the show. I've lost count about how many times you've been on, but this is an episode that has been long in the making. I've wanted to do an episode on not only fascism, which we've covered many times, but specifically focusing on anti-Semitism. I've had some scheduled episodes in the past that, for various reasons, the fault of no one, they just never manifested. They fell through at the last moment. The guest backed out, had something else to do, etc. So it's a long time coming, but it's also fairly timely because we're seeing, just in the wake of the fascist riots on Capitol Hill and the fallout from that, and the role that anti-Semitism plays in not only fascism, but the conspiracy theories that are the bedrock of fascism, whether here or elsewhere. And we'll also get into, areas and blind spots that the left might have when it comes to substantive sort of account or critique of anti-Semitism, and how sometimes that's not as centered as perhaps it should be. So I think this will be a wide-ranging conversation, sort of taking detours when and where they arise, and just trying to think through not just anti-Semitism, of course, but fascism overall, because it is a slippery term. It's historically sort of ill-defined. People can very easily overuse the term. I might even be guilty of that, and perhaps me and Brendan may have some disagreements about when and where to draw the line and call something fascist, which is interesting to explore. But I think particularly at times like this, it really behooves the serious, principled left to think through the nuances and distinctions of this movement and its historical antecedents and where it might be going, and that's all in the service of better equipping ourselves and others to combat it. So I couldn't have a better guest than Brendan, and that's why I have him on to discuss this. So let's go ahead and just get right into it, and maybe starting with the recent riots is the best place to start since it's fresh in everybody's mind. So reflecting on these recent riots, how can we make sense of the ideologies at play? And again, what are your thoughts on calling, I've been calling it a fascist riot, for example. What are your thoughts on calling this group of many different people and ideologies fascist?
Well, I think the event itself was clearly like a fascist event. It feels like it's right in the Fascist Playbook, both like the new and the old fascism. And if people are walking around with swastikas and shirts about the Holocaust, you can assume that they're quite comfortable with fascism. But I think that it's also fair to guess that some people who were there were probably just there because in their minds they're just supporting Trump, and then somebody was like, oh, we're gonna take the Capitol, and they got caught in mob mentality. I think what's dangerous about fascism is that it can utilize non-fascist actors. I think another thing we really need to consider is how many of these people are probably just I don't know, what I would consider sort of neo-Confederates, whose end goal isn't fascism, but since their goal is still white supremacy, they're quite natural allies, and there's significant overlap between those two groups.
Yeah, we talked about this a little earlier about calling the neo-Confederates fascist, and that's something that I would sort of instinctively do is refer to that entire sort of subsect as fascist. And certainly there's fascistic elements. Do you think that term fully applies to groups like neo-Confederates, or where do you draw the line there, or where do the nuances come up there?
Well, I think it's, in my opinion, fascism is kind of got sort of a class collaborationist sort of setting, and a significant amount of what we would consider maybe the deliberate neo-Confederate types are fascists, like David Duke. He's a fascist. We don't need to be nitpicky there. But I mean, the history of the Confederacy in the South, anti-blackness, white supremacy, lynch law, and all of those sorts of things, I think it's a phenomenon that doesn't require fascism by any means. So I think just being aware of that America's white supremacy doesn't need to be inherently fascistic to be violent. It could just as easily be, capitalist, or the old Confederacy had a very old school aristocracy, if you will. I think the thing about fascism really in general is that it's trying to replace one set of elites with another, a set of people who weren't necessarily elite before. And again, I think it's kind of it tends to try to strike itself in a third position sort of way, and a lot of times where they're going to manage the differences between the different classes for the good of the nation, or the white race, or Europe, or whatever the fuck they're thinking.
I think it's an interesting sort of debate to have, and elsewhere in our conversations you've referenced Pinochet, and you say maybe we don't apply the term fascist to Pinochet, and you're obviously putting class collaborationism as a front and center piece of fascism. Would you like to expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think like with Pinochet, it's a counter-revolutionary dictatorship, and I think sort of the knee-jerk reaction, not just among the left, but really in most of society, is that if somebody seems like overly authoritarian to you, you jump to calling them a fascist. Which, like, sometimes in the shorthand, that's totally cool. It gets the point across. But in other ways, it's like, I think like people have been calling Republicans fascist for so long, even when they weren't doing fascistic things. It probably deadened a lot of people to that sort of like point where it's like, okay, like, hey, for the past 4 years now, this has been a fascist party. I think is like, I think some people are like, oh, they're always saying that about us.
Yeah.
I use Pinochet as an example because I think he's a neoliberal dictator, and I the coup that was carried out there was carried out, like basically under the blessing of the United States that did their best to sort of destabilize the economy and create the conditions that would allow that coup to happen. But I mean, these are military establishment people. These are people who were, some of them were part of the Allende government, and trusted to be so. What they did was like unconstitutional, but fascism doesn't really care about, not like, it doesn't require being unconstitutional. In fact, fascists love to utilize like the hallmarks of liberalism wherever they can to get themselves into the positions they need to get to. But Pinochet, like, again, it's very like capitalist. It's very it's neoliberal. And neoliberalism and fascism end up, I think, dovetailing, and can even maybe overlap in some cases. But you're not really seeing like a petite bourgeois class base. You're not seeing the desire to kind of tamp down class antagonisms. Like with Pinochet, it was a desire for the capitalist class to crush this socialist movement, right? Mm-hmm. And what we see with fascists is it's a lot of times the middle classes who are trying to smash the working class movement, and then, hey, maybe they can nudge the people who are at the top out of the way too, and take that place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, in certain instances, it's the ruling elite clamping down. But I think in this instance on Capitol Hill, for example, there's certainly members of different classes at play. But we've talked about how the core base of that movement, and it comes out in these interviews, and it comes out in the identifications after the fact of who are involved, is really this petite bourgeois class strata that is leading the charge here. And part of that, I think, comes out of the economic crisis that falls out of the pandemic, and this downward pressure being put on this middle class, on this small business owning class, and the subsequent reaction to Black Lives Matters, which threatens, because in America the petty bourgeois is so tied up with hierarchies of not only class but race, that Black Lives Matter is another threat to them from a different angle that they're reacting to. And we saw that all throughout the summer with these big, $60,000 extended cab trucks and these expensive boats, Trump's boaters, etc. And as we're looking at the people falling out from this riot, I mean, the lady that was killed, Ashley Babbitt, was a small business owner. Multiple people were either, lawyers, retired Navy colonels, doctors, small business owners, etc. And so, if Pinochet's, Chile is not fascist in that way, would you agree that the movement we're seeing right now here in the U.S. is more fascist on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this point it's more fascist than not.
Yeah.
It's been going that way, and it's pretty much terrified me for a while. I don't know why anybody's like debating the fact that there's like a fascist movement in the United States. Like after Charlottesville, it should have been really obvious how big it has gotten. I think there are a lot of people who we could probably say have economic anxiety that are part of this movement. People who are maybe not the sort of people who didn't have anything, but the people who are afraid of losing what they have. But that's also like, it's about status too, and not just economics. Like a lot of these people are afraid of losing, I mean, not to be like lazy about it, but their privilege and their sort of like privileged status in our society, they feel like all of these people are attacking, quote unquote, attacking their way of life, and there's something that they probably really do believe. So I mean, you can be a doctor and think that people are trying to I don't know, subvert your social order. I would imagine a lot of doctors are quite comfortable with the amount of like privilege they have in the healthcare system relative to a lot of people and things, and maybe are apprehensive of like something that would democratize that, like Medicare for all.
Absolutely. So zooming in on American fascism, it has many intertwined elements, as all fascist movements do. Anti-Semitism, anti-blackness. We see anti-communism, this fear of Antifa and Marxism, or the sign of one of the frontliners storming the Capitol was, the real invisible enemy is communism. There's also this machismo. There's like this middle class, well-off, white guy syndrome that likes to spend thousands of dollars on tactical gear and sort of give his life meaning through a performance of hyper masculinity, which I think is a crucial role in all of this. There's also the conspiracy theory elements. You can't talk about this movement without talking about QAnon, and QAnon is actually less of a specific conspiracy theory more than it is like a structure that any conspiracy theory can sort of be plugged into. And it's sort of a calling board of sorts that you can plug in any conspiracy and make it make sense in the overall structure, which I think makes it so powerful and potent and viral, because it doesn't necessarily cancel out other already existing conspiracy theories, but actually can be plugged into them quite easily in many ways. And it's like a sort of an ongoing collaboration project. Like, that everybody sort of pitches in, they can decode Q, and you follow your favorite QAnon decoder, and what their analysis says you more or less align with and defend against other analysis and stuff. So it's also this unfolding cooperative thing that doesn't necessarily meet its own ends in some ways. So all those elements play a crucial part, especially here in the US. And, anti-blackness specifically. While we see anti-Semitism, anti-communism, machismo, and conspiracy theories in many fascist movements, the anti-blackness, given the history of the U.S., is also incredibly important. And you can't understand this current movement without understanding its reaction to these historic Black Lives Matter protests this year. So can you talk about these different elements and sort of how they come together to form the basis of what we're calling American fascism?
Yeah, I mean, like, as you said, you can't ignore the sort of anti-blackness and the white supremacy. I mean, like, this country is built on, among a couple other things, like the institution of slavery. So anytime you're going to have sort of like a class society or like an inegalitarian society in this country, it's going to have an anti-black foundation. And as you said, the masculinity thing is a big part of it. A lot of the research I'd been doing to prep for this episode, there is fairly common like element of like this sort of toxic masculinity, ideas about gender roles, ideas about like, I don't know, linking sex and violence, a bunch of stuff like that, that we find to be like reoccurring themes in a lot of the people who are willing to go out and commit like violence in the name of, their right-wing movement. And so that's a big part of it too. And yeah, the anti-communism, fascism and communism are pretty much opposite ideologies, because communism is supposed to be egalitarian and it's supposed to be international, right? But they're also like kind of competing over the right to like present an alternative society, because fascism is also opposed to like liberalism, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it needs to crush these progressive working class movements to destroy that threat to that like new order that they're trying to justify. It also is how they're going to grow their base, and it also gives them the support of like big business and the authorities, and that's really useful. When the cops don't take you as much of a threat as the left, then you can get away with a lot more, as we see time and time again throughout history in the United States just this summer. But like where the conspiracy theory part is really, I think, mostly where the anti-Semitism comes in. I mean, in this day and age, one can like not be a racist in the sense of like believing in race or biologically superior races, or even knowing like whether the person they're targeting is a member of a certain race or not, and still engage in racism, whether it's through dog whistles or like sort of like these culturally encoded ideas about like poverty or anything like that, what is or isn't respectable. And so the same thing applies to anti-Semitism, where for a lot of people, they don't necessarily need to say, hey, this is the Jews. They can use any of the classic buzzwords, right? Which would be things like, cosmopolitan, or like cabal, Zionist.
Globalist.
So globalist is definitely one of the newer ones, that's like really big. But like what is globalist? It's international, like the international cabal, right? So it all ties back to like these old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. I remember being in high school and having a friend who was kind of getting into conspiracy theories. And then he showed me this website that was like anti-Semitic as hell. And it was like, and Stalin was a Jew and Lenin was a Jew and blah, blah, blah.
Jesus.
Like, and just like the whole thing. And I was like, dude, like, why are you on this website? And he's like, I don't care about any of that. I'm just interested in the conspiracy. And I'm like, are you shitting me? I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
Why would you think that I would like be interested in this website?
Damn.
But it also forms a really like important, like traditionally with like the fascists, specifically like the Nazis, because I don't think Italian fascism needed anti-Semitism to function, but it was a key part of like the Nazi Germany ideology, right?
Yeah.
So like the whole thing was, Jews created capitalism, Jews created communism. Communism is a Judeo-Bolshevik plot, right? And essentially, like, if you crush one, you crush the other. So they're able to utilize people's, anti-Semitism, which has got a very long history in that part of Europe, and use that to gear people towards anti-communism. You can use people's anxieties about the Bolshevik Revolution, and you use that to get them in this anti-Semitic movement. And so kind of like the thread is one and the same traditionally. And so that's something that's coming into play here. But where it comes in with like the American neo-fascism, is that it helps justify the worldview of like some of these neo-Confederates and militia groups and all of the other sort of like white supremacist counter-revolutionaries we're talking about, right? Because white supremacy is based on the idea that whites are superior. So hypothetically, like in any matchup, especially in one where they have the money and the guns, which they tend to in this country, they should be able to win out, right? That like if you think that they really believe what they believe, that's the mentality that you'd think they would have. So that would probably come with a lot of cognitive dissonance and stress when let's say the Confederacy loses the Civil War, right? Or when in the aftermath of that, the white supremacists managed to frustrate Reconstruction and install Jim Crow laws. And then, now you've got a people's movement that's working to repeal these Jim Crow laws, and it's the same thing for any other movements like the feminist movement, gay rights movement, anything. How are these, inferiors in the minds of these whites able to win? And then it can tie into a theory that's pretty similar to like the German sort of mentality after World War I, that they should have won World War I, and the only reason they lost is because of the Jews. And so I think a lot of these white supremacists believe that, and if like the really hardcore ones pretty explicitly believe that. So they really think that there's this secret cabal that has like controls the media. It's got all of the influence and all the resources, who's infiltrated like Western culture, white culture, and is subverting it from within. How are there so many protesters on the streets? Oh, well, this wealthy Jewish person is paying them. How could Trump have lost? Well, there's a mass election fraud. These are people who believe that the Holocaust didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So they believe like the degree to which, or like people who believe that like Jews have like managed to like fake all of these archaeological digs in the Middle East and stuff like that. Like the degree of manpower to make that sort of thing happen, I don't really even see how that's possible. But they believe it, right? And that's how they justify their losses and how they like maintain their sense of superiority in the face of the reality that they're not any better than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, Alex Fuentes, one of the talking heads of the far right, was present at the Capitol riots. is doing a lot of talking after the fact. He's a Holocaust denier. He's like 22 or 23, and he has this huge audience of far right fascist. And one of the pillars of his whole idea is Christian domination, and coupled with Holocaust denialism. And then we don't talk about it a lot anymore, but even just a few years ago, it was all articles were being written about the Great Replacement theory, which is centered on Jewish people controlling migration flows from non-white countries into white countries. And so even the immigration thing that riles up the far right is tied back to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then the other point you made about, conscious anti-Semitism and, it being sort of the ambient background noise of all of these conspiracy theories and all of the far right ideologies, even if people partaking in it aren't conscious of that. I think that also plays out with anti-blackness on like something like the Proud Boys, where the Proud Boys will have people of color in their midst. They will have even, I think Enrico Tarrio is not white, I guess, and so that you'll have even leadership that is people of color, and they'll use that as an example of how they're actually not at all, white supremacists. They're not anti-black. They're just Western chauvinists and nationalists, etc. But in the actual actions of Proud Boys, time and time again, it is the targeting of black people. I mean, there's instances where they're drunk roaming around DC, and they just see a black guy coming home from work and physically attack him. And so, the actions will speak louder than a lot of what they want to advance. And I don't even know sometimes if the Proud Boys advancing this "we're not racist" line really believe it themselves, or if they're being cynical. I'm sure it depends on the individual spouting that nonsense. But it cashes out in how these movements actually act in the real world, and the sort of ambient background anti-blackness, anti-Semitism that is always present, whether or not it's conscious in the mind of the individuals engaging in these activities,
Yeah, and I mean, hypothetically, you could be a part of this movement and not be anti-black or not be anti-Jewish, like as an individual,
right?
I think I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but there is definitely like a shift in the right where concepts shifted. It's not necessary for some of these people. It's not about biological race. For a lot of them, it is, but for some of them, it's about Western culture, right? So there's nothing wrong with X, Y, or Z population acting in that manner that maintains like what the Proud Boys are calling like Western chauvinism, right? Because you're still protecting like the quote unquote civilization, which is like a white supremacist civilization. So there's that, but not every member of this movement has to believe that they're doing it for racist reasons. The other side of that, right, is this sort of classic like anti-Semites always argue in bad faith, like sort of a thesis that like Sartre put out. And it's pretty accurate. And I mean, you could just see it with like, some of the alt-right and even like TPUSA type people where they're like, we're going to say a statement that like maybe is blatantly false. No, it's blatantly false. And if you don't respond, then people are going to believe the lie and it's going to enhance my argument. Or if you counter that, you can say, oh, I'm just kidding, right? Or I don't mean it like that. Or, you're reading into my words that's got nothing to do with white supremacy, even though it very well might. So there's definitely like a deliberate bad faith argument from a lot of these people.
Yeah, without a doubt. And another way it manifests, I think, even among the people that, on the Trump side, even just broadly, like the MAGA crowd, the way that anti-blackness manifests, and a lot of them will say, I'm not racist. You ask them, like, we're against racism. A lot of them will say that, especially on just like the regular MAGA Trump sort of regular normie people. But the funny thing is the only black people who are seen as their equals or seen as legitimate black voices are only the ones that agree with them, that will only indulge their fantasy of white supremacy implicitly, and all other black voices arguing for any other sort of politic are immediately dehumanized, seen as illegitimate. I mean, black congresswomen, for example, are just there a million different ways that they're dehumanized and delegitimized and not seen as legitimate representatives in the government, etc. So they really tell themselves in that way. And there are Trump supporters out there who really will think, I am not racist. I really am against racism. That's not cool. But then the only black people they grant any legitimacy to is like Candace Owens or whatever weirdo gets up at a MAGA rally and parrots their stuff back to them. And so I think that's also a very insidious way that they can sort of maintain that cognitive dissonance. Well, I'm not racist, and this is why I'm not racist. Look, I like this black person only because he agrees with everything I say, but still he's black, and so I can't be racist. And I think that's a huge, huge thing on not necessarily the consciously fascist aspects of the right, but on that sort of mainstream MAGA right.
Right. I mean, they like if it benefits the fascists, then it benefits the fascists whether the people are conscious of it or not. I'm sure there are plenty of people in Germany who never joined the Nazi party who still, in fact, it's very obvious that there were, who still helped reinforce that regime. And there were probably, I mean, a lot of the Nazis were super anti-gay, and then people love to point out that they were gay. There were gay Nazis. Like, the gay Nazis don't disprove the fact that Nazi Germany was killing gay people. It just means that there were certain people who didn't agree with that specific part of the ideology. And another thing that's going on, right? And this is definitely like a fascist thing. It's an authoritarian sort of thinking that I think the Republican Party is really like enforced within itself for a couple decades now, and it's a big part of why this sort of like fascistic party within a party is able to flourish, is that it becomes about the team, right? Like, you don't have to think, you just say whatever your team says, right? And so you don't critically think, how come these Republicans that are always talking about how you should like be a hardworking person and how you need to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, like, why are they so like critical of the fact that AOC pulled herself up from her bootstraps and used to be a bartender? Like, exactly. They won't shut up about it, right? What a huge like example of them yelling about something that they tell everyone else they need to do. Like, like these Republicans don't think, oh, maybe they're doing that because she's like a threat to their worldview, and she like is like a young person of color in Congress, and these Republicans don't like that, right? No, like, the followers aren't necessarily, they don't want to think that deep, so they're just going to trust what their team says. And there are like a lot of studies that show that like Americans will basically agree with whatever the party line is, regardless if it's a shift. So it's like, you can say $2,000 checks, socialism on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday it's the best policy ever. And and Mitch McConnell has betrayed the party by blocking it, and then the next day after that you can be against it again. You know what I mean? So it's a lot of it's like group and team think as well. So it allows people to hear these dog whistles, which reinforce within people these sort of racial biases, right? Like, if the person doesn't ever have to consciously realize that thug is a coded word for it to do its job and make that person more racist, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And another irony that I like to point out is these people that, they're the fuck your feelings people. They have it on their shirts. In 2016 when Trump won, they said, fuck your feelings, he's your president. You see the Ben Shapiro's, logic and facts. But nothing is more feeling oriented than this exact stuff that you're talking about, because it's sub-rational. It doesn't need logic. It doesn't need to be internally coherent. It is just feeling. And Trump's appeal, which a lot of liberals and even people on the left can't fully understand, like, why do people like this guy? It's not about his business acumen. It's not about his ideology or his intelligence. It's about how he makes them feel. Mm-hmm. And that is the basis. There's something very central about that aspect of it to fascism. This, in psychoanalytic terms, you can call it this libidinal energy or however you want to describe it. But there's also this massive projection where it's like the things that they do, they project onto others violently. And they're the biggest crybabies, like this, the same people that are like, fuck your feelings, he's your president. When their president loses an open and fair election, they just completely deny reality because it doesn't feel good to them. It doesn't feel right. And even talking heads on Fox News would be their argument when there's no evidence whatsoever of widespread election fraud. It's just like they'll revert to saying it's a gut feeling. And you feel it too, right, guys? You feel that gut feeling that something just isn't right. And so it's this projection and this exact inversion of everything they claim to be. I mean, it's if it wasn't so inherently dangerous, it would just be utterly laughable. But I think that's also a crucial pillar of this entire movement.
Yeah, I think that's funny too. Like when you think about it, these sorts of different like tendencies within the U.S. Right? I think the facts and logic sort of like line kind of comes from like these neoliberals who are really into science in their own way. Like the Milton Friedman computer projections prove that capitalism is the like superior system, and that's I mean this is one of the ways I would differentiate it from like the sort of neoliberal bureaucratic authoritarianism of somewhere like Pinochet is like they'll bring in the experts, right? It's their experts, but they'll bring them in. And so when they say things like facts and logic, that's what it's coming from. But the gut feeling like you gotta act right, this is like again this is that sort of like macho like masculinity, like Trump says what he thinks and that's what I like about him, you know, or like fuck your feelings. That sort of mentality is kind of in contradiction to the facts and feelings thing, and I think like the base doesn't care. They'll just parrot whatever is going to help them own the libs, which I think indicates that more people in the base have that second mentality than the first. I think I think that the like sort of neoliberal think tank people are kind of in denial about their own belief in facts and feelings, but I think that they mean it at least initially.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, let's go ahead and keep moving on. And I think the best way to advance from here is to dive into the history of fascism. So, let's dive deeper into the question of fascism and the role that anti-Semitism plays in it. Can you talk a bit about the history of fascism, specifically how it developed in Europe and how it was so, from the outset, inherently tied to a sort of ambient anti-Semitism that was prevalent at that time?
Yeah, so I mean, in Europe, um, we might have talked about this on like the Gramsci episode too, but like in Italy, it's really kind of a response to World War II and this failure in World War II of the internationalist, so like socialist parties to actually endorse internationalism. We've got exceptions. American socialists, Italian socialists, and Russian socialists were pretty strongly anti-war, but in Germany, in France, a lot of the socialist parties essentially like supported World War One, and that completely destroyed the socialist movement in a lot of places other than Russia. And a lot of socialists were like, "How can this happen?" Mussolini was a socialist, and some of his other friends in the fascist movement were also socialists who formed their little clique in a period where there wasn't really strong leadership, and I think that's probably part of why Mussolini was significant at all. So they end up switching to a very strong pro-war stance, because it seems to them that nation is a stronger motivator than class. People are going to go with their national interests over their class interests, and then tied with like what is kind of a theory of imperialism. A country like Italy was never going to get strong as long as countries like the United States, not the United States, sorry, really England, and France, and like sort of the like countries that had a more developed capitalist economy and like these larger overseas empires, would frustrate them. So like the idea was to like switch from a class struggle to a national struggle. Now Germany was inspired by Mussolini, specifically, like especially tactically, the way that like the strikes were like how Mussolini would break strikes, how he would kind of alternate between like this sort of like anti-legal violence and go into more like legal parliamentary measures, and all of that was really effective. And I think the socialist movement in Italy was kind of already on the backslide by 1921 anyway, but to really like hit it hard was what the fascists were good at. And so that definitely inspired Nazi Germany. But for Nazi Germany, there are some like liberal scholars who argue that like Italian fascism and National Socialism are different phenomenon and ideologies, and I think there's an argument to be made for that. In Germany, it was pretty much always anti-Semitic. If you just like look at the history of like Germany, anti-Semitism is not a new thing. When the Crusades started, the Christians just ended up killing a whole bunch of Jews in Germany before they even like went to the Middle East to go, do the same thing to Muslim people there. And so that sort of stuff doesn't necessarily like go away very easily, as we can see in the United States with like anti-blackness. Um, and so it was like a really popular motivator. And you've also got like there's kind of like a cult around Wagner and Wagner's music and Wagner's idea of like the German spirit. And Wagner was like a massive anti-Semite, and there people were already kind of pushing this sort of theory that there are two great races in history, right? There's like Aryan race that doesn't really exist in any way, shape, or form, and the Jews, and they're in an eternal battle, and all of human civilization can basically be like traced to this battle. And the good guys, of course, are like the Aryans, right? Which are hypothetically like this like Indo-Germanic people that the Germans just really weren't,
Yeah.
right? I think like J.R.R. Tolkien, I might be remembering wrong, but the Nazis wanted to like publish The Hobbit or something, and they sent Tolkien a letter asking, like in a coded sense, like trying to ask if he was Jewish before they posted it. And so he wrote a letter that was basically like an FU. And I think one of the points that he made was that like Romani people have more of a claim to being that sort of Aryan race than these sort of like Germans do. But anyway, so all of that sort of stuff ties really into the fascistic ideology in Germany. And in Germany, like I said, like for them, Germany's not, is in a middle position between like Britain and between Italy. Like they had a great military. They, had some colonies, not as much as England, but more than Italy for sure. And so on. How could they lose? How could they lose? Well, we were stabbed in the back. Who stabbed us in the back? The Jews. And so they kind of combined this sort of race ideology with fascism. And that is more or less the kind of ideology of like Nazism. So like the sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy was a big part of it. And they loved things like protocols of like the elders of Zion, and like so like the Bolsheviks are Jews and the bankers are Jews and whatever, anybody you want to hate.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fascinating little dip into history, and it also made me think about how it's really important to note this whole construction of this Aryan race is this fascist retreat into a mythologized past, and that's something we see on the American right today. With Make America Great Again is the obvious example, and then you ask these people, when was America great? They all give you a different answer. Every answer is shittier than the last and more historically incoherent than the last. But it is this retreat into something that never quite existed before, as opposed to an advance forward into progress. And America First, which is a line that Trump makes great use of and the American right makes great use of, was actually, it came out of Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. trying to keep the U.S. out of World War II. And they organized under the banner of America First as a way to not intervene against Hitler and Nazi Germany. So this has a deep, long past, and it's radically connected. And that leads perfectly into the next question, because those connections go even deeper, which, and the question I'll ask you, and we can bat this back and forth a little bit, is what happened to the Nazis after World War II, and what role did the U.S. play in providing cover for some of them and even continuing their work in some interesting ways?
Yeah, after World War II, or Germany ends up being kind of divided up. Russia and the Western powers are kind of trying to establish like the balance of power in this new world order, right? So hypothetically speaking, there was going to be denazification, a bunch of war criminals were going to be put on trial, yada, yada, yada. This is never going to happen again. But in reality, right, like you've got Operation Paperclip, where they're like, all right, we're going to take these Nazi scientists and we're going to put them in, our science thing so we can out-science the Soviets. There's a lot more of that sort of thing that's going on than people realize. So, I mean, in Germany, in West Germany, a lot of like former people who were like judges and stuff during Nazi Germany end up being judges in post-war Germany. So businesses that worked with the Nazis, German and American businesses, which were going to be investigated, basically like the U.S. and I assume other kind of capitalist institutions were like, hey, let's tone that back. Let's not like dig into potential like support for war crimes from the like steel industry or whatever. But I think the scariest and most striking example is that there were people like literally SS officers who managed to go to usually the US, but also like, again, West German and like Soviet intelligence services and say like, hey, I have all of this German war information on the Soviets about what's about their sort of networks in Eastern Europe. We'll give that to you if you don't prosecute me, and in fact, if you give me a job. And so some of these intelligence services are like, yeah, we're anti-communist enough that we will absolutely protect this Nazi war criminal and give him a job. And not only that, but some of these people like managed to stash away some wealth, which we can assume was taken from Jewish and Romani victims of the Holocaust. And so they had that money. Now they get to be part of intelligence networks, and they had the opportunity to kind of survive and form these networks that are going to be important in the resurgence of fascism later. I think their like idea. I'm sure that some of them were really just so anti-Soviet or so anti-US that they really meant to help those countries. Certainly, they like enemy of my enemy logic, but also part of the logic is that this sort of balance of power between the United States and Russia can't last forever, and we might be able to like play the two against each other. And that was also something that some of these Nazis thought.
Yeah, incredibly interesting. And yeah, for those, I mean, I'm sure most people do know, as you said, but yeah, Operation Paperclip was this clandestine CIA-backed operation after World War II to take a bunch of Nazi scientists and provide them cover, protect them from prosecution, give them alternative names and backgrounds, and then use their knowledge against the quote-unquote Soviet threat. And that leads to something I always say, which is, it's not so correct, counter to what we're taught in schools that America defeated the Nazis. I think it's much more correct in many interesting ways to say that America absorbed the Nazis, took them on board, and those Nazis would go on to become a part of American culture and increase that ambient anti-communism that was already present, but pushing it further. And the whole Operation Paperclip of bringing over and saving these Nazi intellectuals and scientists was rooted entirely in the anti-communist crusade against the Bolsheviks and wherever socialism or communism cropped up around the world. So we see this anti-communist pillar go way back to even things like Operation Paperclip. And then another thing that I don't think is talked about quite as much is MK Ultra. We think of MK Ultra as the CIA doing a bunch of unethical, horrific experimentations, but in many ways I think Operation Paperclip and MK Ultra are connected, and the inhuman experiments that Nazis were conducting in a lot of these concentration camps. A lot of those experiments, if not completely, at least in part, were picked up and carried on under the guise of MK Ultra and related projects. And remember that 90% of all documentation related to MK Ultra was destroyed. Everything we know about MK Ultra today just comes from a small slice of paperwork that was actually misplaced in a different building. And so when they were all burned in response to an investigation, those survived. And so, imagine what we don't know regarding MK Ultra. And if you're interested in that, we just released an episode on our sister podcast, Guerrilla History, where we talk exclusively about MK Ultra. But in so many different ways, that fascism, the Nazi fascism, was carried over into America and still lives on in many ways to this very day in our own society. Let's go ahead and move down the line a little bit historically, and I was hoping that you could talk about fascism in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, particularly the rise of the European New Right, what caused that emergence, and even because I know you are fascinated and a part of the punk scene, and you're obviously a lead singer of a punk band, the American punk scene and how that fascist versus the anti-fascist fight started on that level. So you can take that big question in whatever direction you want, but I just continuing that history of fascism.
Yeah, so we've established that a lot of old Nazis survived and managed to maintain contact with each other. But they're kind of stuck in this limbo for a while. And kind of, I don't know, I'd say like in the 70s on, you kind of have like a European new right, which I would consider like revisionist neo-fascism. So like you can say like the old Nazis, they're just Nazis. We don't have to call them neo-fascists. Um, we've got the revisionist neo-fascists. We've got the like sort of nostalgic neo-fascists, and then you've got like populists. So these revisionist neo-fascists, their ideas are going to be to reinvent and rehabilitate fascist ideas while abandoning imagery that would have limited their appeal. And I imagine also that there were a lot of real theoretical mistakes that these people thought needed to be corrected, or they had their own ideas about how the world worked. Some of these people are, they're not really interested in being just the new right, but to kind of transcend right-left dynamics, which, I mean, there are some similarities with like the post-left there. Their ideas are that things like ethno-pluralism and the right to difference. So like we can have a world where there's a whole bunch of different cultures who all do their thing in their own little spheres, right? They also, these are the people who are like studying Gramsci and stuff like that. These are the people who kind of came up with a lot of ideas that the other kind of fascist groups took and ran with, sometimes in ways that like maybe some of the thinkers of the new right would hate. But it doesn't really matter because it worked.
Yeah.
So, you get these sort of like populist parties who are like, okay, yeah, let's abandon all the old traditional fascistic imagery. Let's take these sort of ethno-pluralist right to difference type ideas. You know what I mean? And it's not going to be about supremacy. It's going to be about like separation or whatever. It's, a lot of these groups, they're like, we're going to create basically mass political parties where not everyone even maybe needs to be a fascist to be a part of it. They struggle a little bit until they hit on an issue, immigration. And again, right, like some of these new right people studied Gramsci and stuff like that. One of Gramsci's ideas is that there's this sort of like ideological struggle and this war of position, and that people need to create alliances and sort of like shift the ideological terrain that they're working on, right? So these like far right populists managed to this is the group that managed to like say like, hey, these immigrants are the problem, right? And immigrants is amazing in a far right sense because it is the other. It can function as a replacement for Jews or whatever, who in some of these European countries they just aren't there anymore because of the Holocaust largely. And it also can utilize things like Islamophobia and stuff like that, and it really motivates people. I mean, it's a key, like if you look at Trump, that was a key part of his appeal, and especially in I think his election against Clinton, using that sort of like, we just have to, tamp down on the bad immigrants. They're the source of our problems. They're coming in and they're ruining everything, right? And so they basically force the more mainstream right, the center right, and even the center left to start to adopt some of this anti-immigration rhetoric. They're going to get tough on immigration. So even if these like sort of like right-wing populists don't manage to win the elections, although in some cases, like in the early 90s, they're like winning 25%, which is a lot. But even in the cases where they don't win, they're able to like shift the ideological terrain of the debate. So going back to the new right a little bit, like they studied Gramsci, and another thing Gramsci talks about is creating a proletarian culture. And so that combined with this sort of like post-rightism influenced a whole lot of people to do a whole lot of things. And they basically decide they're going to start, I mean, there's already been a pattern of infiltration, but they're going to like send people to ecology movements. This current world order is destroying the planet. You're aware, who's responsible, whatever, all of that sort of stuff. And they decide to do that with like the punk scene too. In the punk scene, you see a lot of people who are really dissatisfied essentially with like neoliberalism, or like the build up to neoliberalism. But also like in England initially, like just satisfied with like labor and just the state of the country. You've got a lot of very angry young people who are interested in new ideas, interested in rebelling from traditional authority, interested in shocking, right? So in England, I would say there were from the start a solid chunk of consciously left wing punks. And the sort of punk ideology of like do it yourself and stuff like that ties in really well with like sort of like the more like libertarian side of the left, anti-corporate, anti-consumerist, very collectivist in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also a chunk that was like just wearing whatever they wanted to shock people, like Sid Vicious and Susie Sue wore swastikas at various points. A lot of punks did, and some of them like didn't realize what they were getting into. And I think like the Clash, who had a Jewish member and a Jewish manager, ended up kicking Susie Sue out of one of their shows, or because she had a swastika shirt on. She ended up apologizing. I think a lot of these people were 17-year-old kids who were just like, fuck you, dad, I'm gonna shock you with this shirt.
Being edgy.
Yeah. But the far right looks at this largely working class thing and says, hey, what if we got in on that? And this is like some of Gramsci's ideas transplanted to the right. We're going to create a fascist counterculture. We're going to win this war of position by struggling over, culture and ideological terrain. So they basically like astroturf Nazi oi bands. And like oi is like a very working class subgenre of punk, like kind of street punk, if you will, which has borrowed a lot from skinhead culture. I think it's really important to note that like skinhead culture is in England initially was a product of white and black youth coming together, and this very strong influence of like Jamaican ska and stuff. So like the original skinhead music was ska, and there's still plenty of like non-political or like anti-racist skins and like the checkerboard colors that you see on ska kids, that's like that unity thing. And so like skinhead culture also has had that. But the right, there's a band called Screwdriver that's a great example of this, got these like right-wing working class bands that are gonna basically spew right-wing ideas and right-wing ideology to these young working class kids and try to attract them to racism. And so there's already football related violence in England. There's already like fights between like the punks and the mods. There's anti-cop race related fighting going on in the streets, a lot of stuff like that. So there's already kind of a culture of violence that the right is able to really seize on. And that same thing was transplanted to the United States, to California, where there's a lot of Nazis in California. Mm-hmm. So like if you see things in like in American History X, there's a scene where there's like a Nazi punk show. And so, in the punk side of things, there's always been this like anti-Nazi versus Nazi thing, because it's like, you're trying to steal our scene from us, we're going to fight you off. In some scenes, very successfully. I've been led to believe in Nebraska, a bunch of punks beat up a bunch of Nazis in the late 80s and 90s when they would come to shows. And that's why you don't see people with swastika tattoos at punk shows in Omaha.
Beautiful.
I've seen in my life Nazi punks, but luckily I don't think I've ever seen one blatantly show themselves at a punk show in Omaha. Although, I mean, I'm sure it still has happened before, but I digress. So there's like this deliberate like anti-fascist logic. You've got like Dead Kennedys punk songs like Nazi Punks Fuck Off. When the National Front, like one of these like right-wing populist groups, starts like doing really well in England, a bunch of musicians, punk and reggae musicians, set up an event called Rock Against Racism. So they're deliberately pushing this sort of anti-racist side of the punk thing, and like, we have to fight these Nazis. I think there's still the plenty of racism in the punk scene, but there is like this very conscious trend of trying to fight it, which is good. But so like the Nazi skinhead bands, the right term to call it is hate rock, because I don't want it to be associated with oi or skinheads or anything like that.
Right.
So these hate rock bands set up like a Rock Against Communism event. So it's this struggle. And a lot of times, the sort of skinhead associated, or like a lot, sometimes they're called boneheads. So these sort of like Nazi skins, they've got overlap with like hardcore types of music, not like exclusively hardcore punk by any means. They find a lot of success in metal. And then also, like, again, sort of like, that phenomenon of like, football hooliganism. A lot of people like who have that sort of like what we were talking about earlier, that sort of like toxic masculinity mindset, are drawn to these places for the violence. And then the far right was really good at capitalizing on that and utilizing those people as sort of shock troops. The other side of this is that the media focuses really heavily on them. There's a rise in hate crimes in Germany. We're going to look at the Nazi skins, who are oftentimes the people who are doing the like direct act of violence. But what it's done is taken focus away from the sort of populist groups, the infiltration, the revisionists, because they're focusing on the sort of nostalgic side of things, the people who have their like, swastikas and Sig Heil and are trying to smash people's face in with the boot. So the media looks at them and they're not paying attention to, oh, wow, this Holocaust denying group just gave this Republican politician a shit ton of money. I wonder why. The media doesn't pay attention to that. And it also allows mainstream society to shrug the blame off. Mainstream society is going to look at the extreme violence from the neo-Nazis, and they're going to use that as a way to absolve themselves of their own white supremacy. Like, have you ever seen, like, when like Democrats are called racist, they get so offended, right?
Yeah.
No, like, or leftists, like, we don't like being called racist. When people call us out for some things that we have internalized, it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I think like the media's focus on these sort of like countercultural, nostalgic neo-Nazis has allowed mainstream society to avoid looking at itself. And then it also delegitimizes one of the most strongly like culturally left things I've seen in my life, which is punk rock, where like, ideas like socialism and anarchism and anti-fascism and veganism and all of that sort of stuff isn't weird. It's like the norm, right? And so like, but like what, like when you look at like media representation of punk, up until maybe very recently, now that there's like been this very corporatized like consumerist punk, and like you don't have to be a punk to dye your hair weird colors anymore. But in the 80s and 90s, and even I remember like growing up in the 2000s, like punks are always like shown to be like these violent thug, bully, anti-intellectual types, right? And like, people like The Clash or X-Ray Specs, they're writing songs like left-wing songs about really important social issues, and there's like a real social critique that the media has and the Nazis have, whether intentionally or not, managed to completely like take out of what people think of with this culture.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating, and an array of great points, especially about how the mainstream media conceives of these things and uses them as sort of scapegoats to distract from the white supremacy inherent in the mainstream. You've mentioned a couple times the right utilizing Gramscian tactics, and I don't know if you've said all you need to say about that, or if maybe you could just drill down a little bit deeper. Like, what do you mean exactly by Gramscian tactics, and how has the right been even at times better than the left when it comes to employing those tactics?
So, Gramsci, a lot of what we're talking about comes from like the prison notebooks, right? A lot of that work is really theoretical, and it's not necessarily always clear how to apply it. But some people in the new right adapted Gramsci to a right-wing idea, and then some of these other groups started trying different things that, whether consciously or not, but in some cases is conscious, they're going to apply Gramsci. So that means, again, like we've already kind of covered it basically, forming alliances, send some Nazis into the Green Party. The Green Party, most of the Green parties of Europe are pretty explicitly against fascism, but that didn't prevent fascists from infiltrating their parties. And you can run into hippies who buy into a lot of right-wing conspiracy theories in the United States despite not being right-wing themselves.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so like stuff like that to really like normalize immigration is kind of the chief one when we're talking about like politics and that war of position. That like it's hard to think of an issue that helped shift the Overton window to the right in the past 40 years in Europe and the United States as much as immigration. But like this sort of like unwillingness to compromise that we see on, the more like neoliberal right paired really well with the new right. So the combination of both of those groups doing their two respective things was really shifted the ideological terrain.
Yeah.
But another thing is that being willing to make alliances and outreach people and change the way you communicate in order to win them on your side. That's what the right is, for some reason, so much better at doing than the left. I was reading this article called Skin in the Game by someone who used to be a punk black man who was like doing like anti-Nazi work. So that involved infiltration. How in the world are Black people able to infiltrate and get a closer look at the inner workings of this sort of reactionary right in this country? It's because when they shifted from white supremacy to white separatism, right, what they're arguing, hypothetically speaking, is a white ethno-state of their own. So if you're a person of X, Y, or Z minority, it doesn't matter. In some cases, you can even be Jewish. If you're like, I think all Jews should go to Israel, that's the Jewish ethno-state. There are some Nazis who are like, cool, go there, leave us alone, right? So they're willing to make peace with other people whose ideas will still advance their goal, even if they don't like them, right? So there are people who hate people of color, who hate them, but are quite willing, if not comfortable, but quite willing to have people of color come to these, like, these militia expos or wherever it is that they're meeting, especially if they can convince, those people of color to hate some other group of, whether it's convincing, somebody to hate Jews or someone to hate immigrants or whatever. If they can find common cause for a tactic, they'll do it, right? And that's part of why the neo-Confederacy sort of clan types, who, again, a lot of them are Nazis, part of why that happened in the first place, because there was a period of time, right, where the Klan was still kind of really interested in like Protestantism and stuff like that, and probably would have been opposed to a fascist state. And now you've got people in the Klan probably who want a fascist state. I'm not that like, I don't know the thinking of the Klan, but this is kind of the vibe I've gotten. But the Klan certainly got rid of their anti-Catholicism largely, and kind of just like reamped their anti-Judaism. I think like David Duke has something to do with that, if I'm not mistaken. I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I hate this topic.
I understand.
So they're willing to work with people to do a thing, even if they don't agree with them, right? Like they'll work with the neo-libs if it means cracking down on people of color or communists. They're willing to work with, neo-Confederate types because it's for white supremacy. And now at this point, it's impossible to really like pull the two apart, I would guess, the neo-fascism and the like, more traditional American white supremacy. Anything like that. You'll even find some right-wing people willing to support a couple left-wing ideas if they think it'll advance the cause overall. There are so many attempts of the far right to unite amongst themselves. I think like 3 or 4 years back, there was a meeting on like an event at Stone Mountain, Georgia, where like 11 like hate groups announced that they were part of some team that exists now, and that like thing broke apart. But that doesn't mean that all 11 of those hate groups couldn't have had presence on the Capitol last week. Right. They probably did, or at least some of them. So this sort of like that sort of stuff is what I mean, I guess, like where like it's pretty far from Gramsci once you get to that level of application. But like, through the new right, it's made its way there and influenced some of these mechanisms. A lot of it's also just realpolitik too. The Nazis who like got integrated themselves into like American or Soviet intelligence agencies, they weren't motivated by Gramsci. They were motivated by survival and realpolitik.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. And for those that haven't heard, we have an entire episode on Gramsci that I can link to in the show notes, so you can go listen and learn more about that. So let's zoom in towards the end of this conversation. And I think the best way to end this conversation is to talk about how the left, particularly in America, might not fully comprehend the threat of anti-Semitism, the way it manifests, etc. So in what ways does the modern left in America lack a substantive account of anti-Semitism, and why do you think that ultimately is?
Well, I just don't think that the left is largely interested in it, frankly. I don't know. There are certain oppressions that I don't think the left is interested in learning about. I don't think that they think of themselves as being anti-Semitic or anything, but they don't like care to like learn about it. I am sometimes I'm shocked, like when there is like a shooting at a synagogue in the United States, for example, at how little I see from the left in terms of outrage. I think also, I mean, like, I think a lot of the left feels like they know it already. They're like, oh, I learned about the Holocaust in school, which I have a Jewish upbringing, so I can't say for sure, but I'm highly skeptical that American public schools have done an adequate job teaching about the Holocaust. Just like I can say that in American public schools, I learned about white supremacy and anti-blackness, but I know that it was terribly inadequate. They basically lied about who Martin Luther King was to me, right? So, I know that I'm pretty confident, especially like during the Reagan years, there was like a proposal to like add some Holocaust education to the curriculum, and the Reagan administration denied it on the grounds that it was not taking into account the views of Holocaust deniers and the KKK. So that's the country that we're living in.
Yeah.
And I don't think the left really gets how some Jews are still scared, and like Jews in America are really assimilated. I think that has something to do with it. But like Jews in Germany were probably the most assimilated Jews in the world right before the Holocaust. So that doesn't protect anybody, and I think that people who believe it does, whether they're Jewish or not, have their heads in the sand. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The left has also not been immune to this Nazi infiltration, whether it's through ecology or anti-Zionism or what have you. The Nazis managed to have some influence. Again, the Soviets had former Nazis working for them in the intelligence field as well. They had this white supremacist guy whose name I can't pronounce, Yaki. He wrote Imperium, which is like the American Mein Kampf, I guess. I've never read it, thankfully. I think he was indirectly working for the Soviets through, I think, the Czech intelligence agency. I don't remember off the top of my head. In the 70s or 60s, I don't know. He killed himself after like he got arrested by the FBI. But so, we're not immune from that sort of stuff. And Engels was writing about left-wing anti-Semitism in the late 1800s, and I don't think it's something we ever got rid of. I remember reading about like there was like graffiti during the like Russian Revolution in the dual power period that said like, down with the Jew Kerensky, like long live Trotsky or some shit like that. Like aside from the fact that Trotsky is Jewish, and I'm not sure that Kerensky was, like, which is funny enough. I mean, that shows like we've had this problem. I think a lot of the left is really in denial about some of the crimes some of the socialist countries committed against various ethnicities, and that includes the Jews. There was a show trial in one of the Eastern Bloc countries where they accused this communist of being like, some huge Zionist, and he was like one of the most like fervently like anti-Israel politicians in the country. but he was Jewish, right? And so they're like, oh, he's a Zionist, and they got him to confess or whatever, and they killed him. I don't know. So like we have those legacies too, and if we're not willing to look at those, then we're not going to have the problem. I think it's cost us in a lot of ways. The left, Jewish people have made a disproportionately significant part of our like bloc in some countries, and like Labor in England, or like again, a lot of the Bolshevik leadership, and before they were all purged, were Jewish. There are Labor Bund Jewish. There are Jewish labor parties throughout the world, and I think the left has kind of taken that for granted. And failed to like kind of just like honestly it's the same as anybody else. Like listen to the voice of the people. Like if there's an attack on Jewish people, like don't be silent, learn about these things, like try to like figure out like, hey, if a Jewish person says this thing is anti-Semitic, maybe I shouldn't tell them that it's not. Maybe I should try to figure out why they feel that. But I also want to say that I think that Jews are increasingly looking at, when I was like doing research on the rise of hate crimes and stuff in the past several years, Jews tend to think that anti-Semitism is apolitical and it's across the political spectrum. And again, I think like the right has successfully managed to influence the left and the center in the past several decades now. So some of those ideas do come from the right wing in origin. But also, I think like it's the media, I think, tends to like overemphasize how anti-Semitic it is. And there's a conundrum when you've got Nazis, Israelis, and like Palestinian freedom fighters who all push this idea that Israel is like inherently associated with the Jews and then drops it when it's not convenient, right? Like, so if like somebody's critiquing Israel will be like, hey, that's anti-Semitic, even if it's not. But sometimes there is a lot of anti-Semitism that comes in the anti-Zionist movement. And I don't know, it's really complicated to look at, and it's really hard to unpack it. And a lot of people on a lot of different sides are actually reinforcing one another's ideas and contributing to the problem. But I think the media tends to like overemphasize how bad of a problem it is on the left, not in terms of like because it's not a problem on the left, but again in terms of not fully addressing how much of a problem it is in the center and the right. Right.
Yeah.
Like it's the right tries to use this as a tactic. They're like, look at how like much we support Israel, but they also rely on this entirely anti-Semitic conspiracy theory system. So they're kind of throwing weird conflicting images that confuse people, and the media can unintentionally play into it. And the media is not biased towards the left like the right thinks. The media is biased towards the center. And so, their coverage of Corbyn tended to focus on the anti-Semitism. The right doesn't get that sort of attention. I don't think the media has done an adequate job talking about how anti-Semitic some of the things Donald Trump has said or like how much of a like undercurrent of anti-Semitism exists in some of these conspiracy movements. But like the media will post articles that I frankly think are anti-Semitic, saying that like Bernie Sanders, like some Jews think Bernie Sanders isn't Jewish enough or whatever. Like some 77% of Jewish people vote for the Democratic Party. Like there's not an overwhelming amount of support from Jews for the Republicans because of like the Republicans' hawkish like stance on Israel. But the media sometimes pushes that narrative. I think that they like, I've never seen an article about how the Tories in England are anti-Semitic, but I've seen a whole bunch about Labor. So it reinforces it. So I think like a lot of people on the left get really offended. They're like, wow, like they're just totally distorting us. They're really focusing on us. They're ignoring right-wing anti-Semitism, but as a result, they like don't notice like, hey, you're losing Jewish votes and that might cost you this election. I'm talking about Labor.
Yeah.
And it's just a really ugly mess. I am much more comfortable on the left as a Jewish person than anywhere else.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that is honestly important, nuanced analysis, and it's an analysis you don't really hear, where you're willing to parse out these distinctions and nuances that a lot of people just are too lazy to think through, or they're too quick to foment themselves into a defensive posture, not think through what's being said or what's being put out there. So I think that that's actually one of the clearest, best little explorations of this problem that I've come across. So thank you for that, and I think that might be a great way to end this wonderful, important conversation. This conversation, we covered a lot of history, we covered a lot of topics. You might agree or disagree with certain definitions of fascism, etc. But the thing that both Brendan and I wanted to accomplish with this episode is to look at the complicated wrinkles of these things, how anti-Semitism is related to anti-Blackness, how the history of fascism fuels fascist riots to this very day, and just not think of these things in overly simplistic terms, because at the end of the day, it only hurts the anti-fascist forces to have a half-assed analysis of what fascism is, or to rest on your laurels thinking you understand the fascist phenomena when it's in a constant state of evolution. So thank you again, Brendan, for coming on the show, and let's talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Molten kisses leave burns down your arms. What's rising, yet still you'll never